A forgotten king, a myth-shattered villain, and a grave lost beneath a city parking lot. When Richard III's bones emerged in 2012, science promised closure. But the DNA test intended to confirm his royal bloodline instead uncovered a secret so explosive that the truth was sidestepped for years. In 2025, new technology finally traced the break, revealing the York dynasty's claim to the throne may have been nothing but a centuries-old lie. How did one royal blood test rewrite English history? August 22, 1485. The fields near Bosworth are thick with mud and blood. Richard III, last king of the Plantagenet line, falls in the chaos, struck down at 32. His death closes the book on the Wars of the Roses and hands the crown to the Tudors. But for Richard, defeat is only the beginning of his erasure. Stripped naked, his body is thrown over a horse and paraded through the streets of Leicester. Onlookers gather, staring at the battered corpse of their former king. There is no royal procession, no mourning. Instead, he is buried hastily in the Friary of Greyfriars in a grave barely big enough for his frame. No monument marks the spot. A few decades later, the Reformation sweeps across England. Greyfriars is dissolved, its stones carted off, the graveyard lost beneath new buildings and new rulers. Stories spread that Richard's bones were dug up and tossed into the River Soar, as if even his remains were too dangerous to leave undisturbed. No one can say for certain where the last Plantagenet king lies. His memory is left to rumor and propaganda. The Tudors, eager to cement their grip on the throne, turn Richard into a cautionary tale. Chroniclers and playwrights paint him as a twisted villain, a usurper whose body reflected a corrupt soul. Shakespeare's Richard is a limping, scheming monster, rudely stamped, unfinished, sent before his time into this breathing world. For centuries, this image sticks. School children recite lines about the hunchbacked king, the man who murdered his nephews and clawed his way to power. The real Richard, the one who ruled for barely 2 years, is lost behind myth and stagecraft. With the passage of time, the Plantagenet dynasty fades into legend. The Tudors build their own story, one of righteous victory and divine favor. Richard's simple grave vanishes beneath layers of city life, paved over by centuries of forgetting. The last king to die in battle becomes a ghost, his reputation shaped not by fact, but by the needs of those who followed. In the absence of a grave, in the silence of lost bones, a vacuum opens. Into it pour rumors, plays, and half-truths, leaving a nation with a villain and no body, until science, centuries later, dares to ask where the real Richard went. Philippa Langley never accepted the idea that Richard III was just a monster conjured by Tudor propaganda. Sitting in her small study, surrounded by stacks of books and faded maps, she kept circling the same question: where was Richard's grave? The official stories, bones thrown in a river, a vanished churchyard, never satisfied her. Langley became convinced the truth lay somewhere beneath the modern city of Leicester. She pored over medieval maps, overlaying them with satellite images and city planning records. Each line, each street, each lost wall was a puzzle piece. Again and again, her research pointed to one unlikely location: a city council parking lot behind a row of social services offices. Convincing anyone else was another matter. University archaeologists dismissed her theory as fantasy. City officials rolled their eyes at the idea of digging up prime parking spaces for a king lost to legend. Even the Richard III Society, devoted to redeeming his name, hesitated to back such a gamble. But Langley pressed on, writing letters, lobbying councils, and organizing meetings that often ended in polite rejection. With official funding out of reach, she turned to the public. Crowdfunding sites lit up with donations from history buffs, amateur sleuths, and the simply curious. Each pound raised was a small vote of confidence in a story that had outlasted centuries of rumor. When permission finally came, it arrived with strict limits: a single trench no more than a few meters wide, cut straight through the asphalt. The University of Leicester Archaeological Services agreed to supervise, but expectations were low. The City Council issued parking suspensions for just 2 weeks, barely enough time to scratch the surface of 5 centuries of urban sprawl. In August 2012, heavy machinery rolled onto the lot, carving through tarmac and gravel. Archaeologists and volunteers worked under a constant drizzle, scraping away layers of modern debris. Langley watched every move, her nerves stretched tight. The first trench ran along the line she had marked on her overlays. Within hours, the team uncovered human leg bones, unexpected but not impossible for an old friary burial ground. Then the trench revealed more, a grave shallow and oddly short, with bones pressed against its edges. The site supervisor called for a halt. Langley stood at the edge of the pit, rain pooling in the fresh earth, staring down at the remains. The odds of finding anything on the first day in the first trench were astronomical. Yet here, beneath faded white lines and oil stains, lay the first real evidence that the king in the car park might not be just a myth after all. The grave was little more than a gash in the earth, barely long enough for the body forced inside. Bones pressed against the raw sides, the head thrust up at an unnatural angle, signs of haste, not honor. This was no king's resting place, but the grave of a man stripped of dignity, buried in silence by the victors. The skeleton itself told a story as raw as any chronicle. The bones belonged to a male in his early 30s, matching Richard III's age at death. The right shoulder sat higher than the left, the spine arched in a long, severe curve, evidence of adolescent-onset scoliosis. Not the monstrous hunch of legend, but a real deformity that would have been visible through clothing, shifting the body's balance, shaping every step and gesture. The right side of the rib cage was compressed, the vertebrae twisted sharply from mid-back to pelvis. Yet the arms and legs showed no sign of wasting or withering. This was a body marked by pain but also by adaptation, a man who rode, fought, and ruled despite the constant drag of his own skeleton. The skull bore the brunt of violence. 8 separate wounds marked the head alone. A blade had sliced through the right cheek, exposing teeth and jaw. Another blow carved a deep notch above the left eye. At the base of the skull, a gaping hole, probably from a sword or halberd, suggested the fatal strike. A smaller puncture, driven from above, matched the point of a halberd blade forced through the crown. Several wounds showed no sign of healing, inflicted in the final moments of battle. On the jaw, a cut ran across the bone, likely delivered as the helmet was torn away. The back of the head was shattered, as if struck repeatedly after the body had already fallen. 2 more wounds on the ribs and pelvis hinted at the chaos of the melee, perhaps delivered as the body was stripped or dragged from the field. In total, 10 distinct injuries. Most were sharp force injuries from sword, dagger, and halberd delivered with the kind of force found only in close combat. The pattern pointed to a man unhorsed, surrounded, and finished off in a frenzy. No signs of defense on the forearms or hands. The attack was overwhelming, the end quick and brutal. Forensic analysis found no evidence of a royal shroud, no coffin, just fragments of earth packed around the bones. The burial was hurried, the grave unmarked. Yet the details of the skeleton, age, sex, battle wounds, and the unmistakable curve of the spine matched the last moments of Richard III with uncanny precision. The evidence was mounting, but the bones alone could not silence 5 centuries of rumor. To prove the king in the car park was truly Richard, the investigation would have to go deeper, into the code of life itself. Inside the University of Leicester's ancient DNA lab, the air is filtered, the lights are harsh, and every surface gleams with the threat of contamination. Technicians work in sealed suits, their faces hidden behind masks and visors. The bones, 5 centuries old, offer little margin for error. Most DNA is shattered by time, broken into fragments by water, heat, and the slow grind of bacteria. To find anything usable, the team drills into the dense core of a tooth and the thick shaft of a femur, chasing the last protected traces of genetic code. The team's target is mitochondrial DNA, called mtDNA, a thread passed down from mother to child, unchanged for generations. Unlike nuclear DNA, which mixes and reshuffles with every parent, mitochondrial DNA travels a single, unbroken line. Richard III had no surviving children, but he did have a sister, Anne of York. Her female descendants, traced through 17 generations, lead to 2 living people: Michael Ibsen, a Canadian-born cabinetmaker, and Wendy Doldig, a retired Australian teacher. Their family trees, painstakingly reconstructed from parish records and birth certificates, converge on the Plantagenet past. Under the microscope, the extracted mitochondrial DNA is amplified and sequenced, base by base. The results are stark. Skeleton 1 carries a rare type, haplogroup J, shared by Ibsen and Doldig. The odds of a random match, given the rarity and the number of generations, are less than 1 in a million. The sequence is exact. No mismatching letters, no gaps. Every maternal ancestor from Anne of York down to the present left the same genetic signature. The evidence is not circumstantial. It is mathematical, statistical, and cold. On February 4, 2013, the University of Leicester calls a press conference. Scientists, journalists, and descendants gather in a room thick with anticipation. The announcement is brief but seismic. The remains found beneath the Leicester parking lot are, beyond reasonable doubt, those of King Richard III. The match is not just close, it is definitive. For the first time in half a millennium, the identity of the last Plantagenet king is no longer a matter of rumor or royal propaganda. It is written in the code of his mother, carried undisturbed through centuries of exile and obscurity. The bones in the car park belong to Richard. The case is closed, at least on the maternal side. As the applause fades, the scientists turn to the next test, the paternal line, and a question that will not be so easily answered. The promise of DNA is certainty, letters and markers that cut through centuries of rumor. But when scientists turn to the Y chromosome, the code that passes from father to son, the clarity shattered. The plan was simple. Compare Richard's Y chromosome, extracted from his ancient bones, to living male line descendants of the Somerset family. These men, proud of their direct, documented descent from Edward III, had every reason to expect a match. For 19 generations, the records traced an unbroken chain from the Plantagenet kings to their own cells. The test results arrived in silence. Richard's Y chromosome did not match the Somersets. Not a close call, not a minor difference, an outright mismatch. The genetic markers were so distinct that statistically they could not belong to the same paternal line. Somewhere between Edward III and Richard III, the official story of royal descent broke down. The term used in genetics is false paternity event, a polite way of saying that at some point the biological father was not the man recorded in the family tree. The implications hit like a thunderclap. For centuries, the English monarchy's legitimacy rested on the idea of a pure, unbroken male bloodline ordained by God, confirmed by law, and recorded by chroniclers. The DNA now showed that this line had been interrupted. The Somersets, whose family trees were as thick as any royal archive, stood on one side of the divide. Richard III, last of the Plantagenets, stood on the other. The break could have happened anywhere in the 19 generations separating them, but the effect was the same. The royal bloodline, so fiercely guarded and fought over, was not what it seemed. Institutional responses came quickly. The university team published their findings, but with careful language. The term false paternity event replaced the raw shock of the discovery. The media, hungry for a king found under a parking lot, barely lingered on the genetic contradiction. Yet beneath the headlines, a central mystery was born. The maternal line had delivered certainty, but the paternal line had opened a wound that would not close. The Y chromosome, meant to confirm the Plantagenet legacy, now threatened to upend it. The question was no longer just who lay in the grave, but whether the story of England's kings could survive the truth written in their blood. The announcement of the DNA results in 2014 made headlines around the world, but the most unsettling discovery was quietly buried in the fine print. The scientific paper published in Nature Communications confirmed the Y chromosome mismatch between Richard III and the living Somerset line. Yet the language was measured, almost clinical. The authors wrote of a false paternity event somewhere in the 19 generations separating Richard III and his supposed modern relatives, but they left the timing deliberately vague. The break could have happened in the Plantagenet line, or it could have crept in among the Somersets. Without more ancient DNA, they said no one could say for certain. Behind the scenes, the process was anything but casual. Peer reviewers pushed for restraint, wary of scandalizing royal descendants or igniting media frenzy. Editorial teams at the university and the journal weighed every phrase. References to the Yorkist claim were softened, speculative passages trimmed. The final version focused on the triumph of finding Richard, not the bombshell lurking in his DNA. University press officers shaped interviews and press releases to emphasize the archaeological achievement. The Y chromosome controversy became a footnote, not a headline. Journalists hungry for a story of a king found beneath a parking lot followed the script. News stories celebrated the identification, the battle wounds, the spine that confirmed centuries of rumor. The deeper question, the possibility that the Yorkist claim to the throne was built on a biological error, barely surfaced. For most, the discovery was a tale of lost and found, not of legitimacy ripped from the heart of English history. Inside the scientific community, the decision to tread carefully was standard practice. Extraordinary claims demand extraordinary proof. With only 2 sets of bones and a handful of living descendants, the evidence was strong but not absolute. The risk of overreaching was clear. Still, in the cautious language and the curated press strategy, something vital was set aside. The DNA had delivered a result that threatened centuries of royal narrative. Instead of confronting it, the institutions involved chose to wait for more data, more certainty, and perhaps a more convenient moment. The scandal, for now, was contained within the boundaries of academic caution. In 2025, a new scientific alliance set out to answer the question that had haunted royal history for a decade. Where exactly did the Plantagenet bloodline break? The team brought together geneticists from the University of Leicester, Harvard Medical School, and the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology. Each member arrived with a different specialty: ancient DNA, statistical genomics, protein chemistry, and epigenetics, all converging on a single goal. The tools at their disposal belonged to a different era from the first Richard III tests. Instead of piecing together short, fragile fragments, long-read sequencing allowed them to read stretches of ancient DNA that had once seemed hopelessly broken. This technology, still new to the field, could map entire chromosomes with far fewer gaps, making it possible to follow a genetic signature through centuries of decay. Alongside it, proteomics offered another layer of evidence. By extracting and analyzing ancient proteins from bone, the team could confirm not just ancestry but also physical traits and even some health markers independent of DNA's weaknesses. Epigenetic mapping, meanwhile, gave a glimpse into the lived experience of the individual: diet, stress, even exposure to toxins etched into chemical patterns that survived long after the flesh was gone. The consortium secured new samples from both ancient remains and living descendants. Each was processed under the tightest controls with chain of custody records and cross-checks to rule out contamination. Every step was logged, every molecule accounted for. Their approach combined forensic caution with the reach of modern genomics, promising a level of certainty that had been impossible in 2014. By comparing the Y chromosomes and protein markers from multiple sources across the Plantagenet and Somerset lines, the team believed they could reconstruct the true shape of royal descent. The promise was clear: with these methods, the mystery that once seemed unsolvable could finally be pinned down to a single generation, perhaps even a single name. The question was no longer whether science could expose the truth, but whether history was ready for the answer. Permission to sample the remains of John of Gaunt, son of Edward III, required months of negotiation and layers of legal oversight. His burial site, long regarded as sacred ground, became the focus of a new kind of royal inquiry, one that asked not for relics or monuments, but for fragments of bone and the silent code within. The team approached the exhumation with forensic caution, documenting every step, every transfer, every speck of dust. Chain of custody logs and sealed containers replaced the old rituals of royal remembrance. Inside the lab, the protocols left no room for doubt. Ancient DNA extraction demands a level of precision that borders on obsession, with negative controls, duplicate samples, and independent verification guarding against the ever-present threat of contamination. The scientists worked in shifts, repeating each test, each sequencing run, until the data was unassailable. It was not enough to find a match; they needed statistical certainty. A result that could stand against 5 centuries of rumor and error. The analysis focused on the Y chromosome, the thread that, in theory, ran unbroken from Edward III through John of Gaunt to the present-day Somerset line. The genetic code, read in long, continuous stretches, revealed a pattern that was both familiar and ancient. When the sequences were compared, the result was stark, a 99.9% probability that the Somerset Y chromosome was unchanged since the 15th century. Every marker, every mutation, every silent letter lined up with the profile drawn from John of Gaunt's remains. The margin for error was vanishingly small, far beyond what could be explained by coincidence or laboratory artifact. This was not a theoretical connection or a genealogical assumption. The Y chromosome carried by the Somersets was, at every measurable point, the same as that of the Plantagenet prince buried centuries before. In the language of genetics, this was as close to an unbroken chain as science could offer. The anchor point had been found, not in legend or paperwork, but in the code itself. The question that had haunted royal history now had a fixed reference, and the search for the break could finally move forward, guided by evidence rather than speculation. The evidence locked onto a single fracture point in the royal bloodline, shattering the centuries-old story of Yorkist legitimacy. The genetic anchor drawn from the Somerset line and believed to mirror the Y chromosome of John of Gaunt showed a perfect match across centuries. But Richard III's Y chromosome stood apart, a genetic orphan, disconnected from the line it was supposed to continue. The break was not hidden deep in the Somerset generations, nor lost among distant cousins. It landed squarely between Richard, Earl of Cambridge, and his son Richard, Duke of York, the very man whose claim to royal blood ignited the Wars of the Roses. This was not a subtle crack, but a total collapse. The Duke of York, father to both Edward IV and Richard III, was not the biological son of the Earl of Cambridge. The family tree, so carefully guarded and weaponized in battle and parliament, was built on a false connection. The consequences ripple outward. Edward IV's right to the throne disappears. His sons, the famous princes in the Tower, lose their claim as well. Richard III, who seized the crown by declaring his nephews illegitimate, now stands revealed as an illegitimate king himself, his own bloodline cut off from the very ancestry that justified his rule. The wars that tore England apart for decades, the battles, betrayals, and executions rested on a claim that DNA now exposes as hollow. All the legal arguments, all the propaganda, all the lives lost in the name of Yorkist right collapse under the weight of a single genetic truth. The break between Cambridge and York is not just a family scandal, it is the unraveling of a dynasty. Rumors that once sounded like political slander, whispers about Cecily Neville and a child not fathered by her husband, take on a new, chilling plausibility. The throne that so many died for was, in the end, built on a lie. Cecily Neville's name lingers in the margins of royal history, sometimes as a pious matriarch, sometimes as a shadowy figure at the heart of a dynasty's crisis. When chroniclers whispered about her alleged affair during her husband's absence, few imagined that centuries later genetic evidence would breathe new life into those rumors. The possibility that she orchestrated a baby swap or adopted a child to secure her family's claim now sits uncomfortably close to the center of the Yorkist story. In a world where a single misstep could mean exile or death, survival demanded calculation. The adoption theory, once dismissed as slander, suggests Cecily may have chosen to raise a son not fathered by the Earl of Cambridge, presenting him as the legitimate York heir. Whether she acted out of desperation, ambition, or love, the consequences reshaped English history. Edward IV, Cecily's eldest surviving son, carried the weight of that secret, whether he knew it or not. His reign was dogged by questions about legitimacy, sharpened by the infamous pre-contract with Lady Eleanor Butler. What if that pre-contract was not just a legal technicality, but a frantic attempt to shore up a bloodline already on shaky ground? Edward's lavish court, his relentless myth-making, and his sudden moves to secure his children's futures all take on a different cast in light of genetic uncertainty. The insecurity that haunted his rule may have stemmed from more than political rivalry. It may have been rooted in the knowledge or suspicion that his own claim was fragile. For Richard III, the revelation is even darker. History casts him as the villain who swept aside his nephews, the princes in the Tower, to seize the crown. But if he learned late that his entire family's claim was built on a lie, the motive for their disappearance shifts. The removal of the princes becomes not just a grab for power, but an act of erasure, a desperate attempt to cleanse the royal line of a secret too dangerous to surface. Richard's story, once painted in the stark colors of villainy, now blurs into tragedy. A king driven by fanatic loyalty to a legacy that, in the end, was never truly his. Centuries of royal legitimacy rest on stories, not just chromosomes. As DNA technology rewrites history in real time, it exposes how power often depends on what we choose to believe. In the age of genomics, every throne, past or present, faces the same question: is bloodline truth or just a story we agree to follow? The answers we accept today may decide who rules tomorrow. What do you think? Does the myth matter more than the molecule?